Unfortunately, Dr. O'Malley's video wasn't working during this recording, but the sound is perfect. Enjoy.
Hi, thanks for coming again to watch another recording from the Be Bold History Network. I'm really delighted today to be meeting with Dr. Vincent O'Malley, who's a historian in New Zealand. He's going to talk to us about the New Zealand Wars. And I know that lots of history teachers in the UK at the moment are really interested in teaching more colonial history. So hopefully this will be a really good opportunity for you to get an education into a side of colonial history that we're perhaps not so aware of in the UK. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand over to Dr. O'Malley.
Kia ora, greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to history teachers in the UK about some of the work I'm doing and the history around the New Zealand Wars. So all around the world this year, we've seen countries reflecting on their histories and how these are remembered. The Black Lives Matter movement, protests following the murder of George Floyd by American police, and the toppling of statues around the world, including, of course, slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. And these have opened up discussion and debate. And New Zealand hasn't been immune to that either. Here in June this year, we saw the removal of the statue of Captain John Feyn Charles Hamilton, who was killed in the Battle of Gate Pa in April 1864. And his statue was removed by Hamilton City Council. The city of Hamilton is named after Captain Hamilton, although famously he never actually visited that place. And we've also had a lot of discussion and debate around street names and place names and how we remember this history. So Hamilton was killed at Gate Pa, which is one of the most famous battles of New Zealand Wars, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So New Zealand Wars were a series of conflicts that profoundly shaped the course and direction of the nation's history, fought between the Crown and various groups of Maori between 1845 and 1872. The wars touched many aspects of life in 19th century New Zealand, even in Ashian regions where there was no fighting. So these were transformative events in the nation's history. And physical remnants or reminders from these conflicts and their aftermath can be found all over the country, whether in central Auckland, Wellington, Dunedin, or more rural locations such as Te Porere or Te Awamutu. And here's a memorial alcove at Auckland War Museum to those who fought and died in the New Zealand Wars. And I'm going to be talking a bit today referring to pa. So that's a Māori term that refers to fortifications. And here's one of the best preserved ones. This is at a place called Te Porere, which is near Lake Taupo in the central North Island. So that's an example of the pa, the fortification system. So many New Zealanders, Māori and Pākehā refers to New Zealanders of European descent. Many people can trace their descent from at least one ancestor who fought in these wars. And some people will have forebears who fought on both sides. The wars are an integral part of the New Zealand story, but as a nation, we haven't always cared to remember or acknowledge them. For a lot of the period since the wars ended in 1872, Pākehā have either clung to a highly romanticised version of these wars that emphasised kind of mutual chivalry and bravery and heroism, but was actually devoid of these more disturbing realities of what took place. And when that no longer became tenable, really, we just kind of ignored this history as if it hadn't happened. But this is our story, it's our history, and it happened here in this place quite recently in historical terms, and it had profound consequences for what the nation was and what it would become. These were the defining conflicts in New Zealand history, in my view. That's what I've been arguing for years now. So that's why it's really important to learn about, to remember, and to acknowledge this history. Well, to say that the wars were fought between Māori and the Crown is slightly misleading, because on the one hand, you had Māori who fought on both sides. Māori are a tribal people. There are dozens of tribe, or iwi as we call them. And sometimes particular Māori communities switch sides, fighting for the Crown and then against it, or vice versa. And that wasn't because they were being inconsistent or they were confused, but it pointed to the fact that local and tribal interests were very much at the forefront when allegiance was being decided. And those could change quite quickly depending on the context. But as far as the Crown was concerned, Māori were either for it or against it. And a lot of tribes would have preferred just to avoid these conflicts altogether, but neutrality often wasn't an option. When you were in the path of an invading British army, you had to make life or death decisions very quickly. So British Imperial troops did the bulk of the fighting on the Crown side before 1865. And for the rank and file British soldier, of course, this is the pre-reform British Army. Life in the army was tough. The pay was poor. The living conditions were often squalid. Alcoholism was rife. Discipline was very, very harsh, including brutal public floggings that sometimes left the grown men who witnessed them in tears. So this is not a fun place to be at all. And desertion, understandably, was very, very high rates of desertion from the British Army during the New Zealand Wars. And just as loyalist Māori had their own reasons for fighting on the Crown side, so did many of those who enlisted in the British Army. And it often wasn't about, that they were idealists for empire or anything like that. The really incredible fact about the New Zealand Wars is that we know, thanks to the research of Dr. Charlotte MacDonald, who's got a project called Soldiers of Empire, that 2/3 of the rank and file troops who fought in the New Zealand Wars were actually Irish. And at that rate, you almost need to call it the Irish Army rather than the British Army. So incredibly high numbers of Irish troops fought in the New Zealand Wars. And as somebody of Irish ancestry myself, I often wondered, what did these Irishmen think of fighting a war of conquest and dispossession for the very same Crown that had done that to their people, to their country? I mean, Ireland is the original blueprint for British imperialism in many ways, and here they are doing to Māori what had happened to their own people. The short answer to that is a lot of those troops were illiterate, so there aren't a lot of letters and diaries recounting their thoughts and experiences about what they were being asked to do. But there is enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that a lot of them became increasingly disillusioned with these wars. And really the question they asked themselves was, why should they be tasked with robbing Māori of their lands for the exclusive benefit of settlers in New Zealand? And, why weren't the settlers in New Zealand doing their own dirty work? Why were they relying on British troops to do this for them? And at the very same time, especially in the 1860s, you had a lot of British taxpayers asking, why were these funding these wars of conquest on the other side of the globe when they derived none of the spoils, they derived none of the benefit from it? And it wasn't just the rank and file troops who became disillusioned with the wars either. Their commander between 1861 and 1865, General Duncan Cameron, who was a Scotsman, he became increasingly disillusioned with these wars, and he did see them as wars of conquest and dispossession, and he fell out with the governor at the time, and so there is this growing sense of these wars being something that the British Army didn't want to be here. So after 1866, British troops are progressively withdrawn from the country. The last regiment leaves in 1870, the 18th Royal Irish Regiment, final troops to leave the country. But a large number of the troops remain behind. They take their discharge in New Zealand, or they desert from the army. And some of those troops end up actually marrying Māori women from the very same tribes that they've been fighting against, which is why you have a lot of Māori today who can trace their ancestry both to British soldiers and to their own Māori communities. So after 1866, colonial troops, including conscripted militia, volunteers, military settlers and specialist units, such as the armed constabulary, along with their Māori allies, are solely responsible for fighting the war on the Crown's side. And it's solely the colonial government rather than the imperial government that's making those decisions as well after that time. So that the New Zealand Wars become colonial wars really after 1866. And a lot of settlers feel that they've been abandoned by their supposed mother country, and actually relations with Britain sink to an all-time low in the late 1860s because Britain withdraws from these conflicts. So this is no longer an imperial war, but an internal one, and you have new colonial units that are set up to fight it. So the British government basically washes its hands of the whole affair. On the other side of the conflict, the Maori communities that they fought against had no standing armies. They're basically a civilian population fighting in defence of their homes and their lands, often with weapons dating back decades. Usually they didn't have artillery or adequate ammunition. And, you know, for example, the Crown forces, the British forces had armour-plated steamers and Māori had wooden canoes. So this is asymmetrical warfare. And Māori are also outnumbered in most of these conflicts, at least 3 or 4 to 1. So really it should have been no contest. You've got a tiny civilian population with no standing army, no supply train, no artillery, often, up against really the world's superpower at the time, which Britain was in the mid-19th century. And to make matters worse, Māori are often fighting against their will in conflicts that have been provoked by the Crown. So if we ask what was the cause of the wars, we're probably starting off in the wrong direction because these are a complex series of events. And although there's often a single catalyst, there's usually a whole series of underlying causes. In the case of the New Zealand Wars as well, we call them wars plural because there's a whole series of separate conflicts which have connections but are also distinctive in some ways. So to talk about some of the common or occurring themes in these wars, the obvious one is land. In short, Māori had it and the British wanted it. And something had to give, especially as the pace of British migration increased sharply after 1840, which is when the Treaty of Waitangi is signed. You know, I'll come back to that shortly. Even before 1840, private parties, including land companies such as the New Zealand Company, claimed to have purchased more land than there was in New Zealand. And the New Zealand Company is one of the leading figures in this. And their actions provoke conflict throughout the country as well. So as part of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, the government assumes the sole right to purchase Maori lands under the treaty. And massive Crown purchases follow. So you see on the map here, before 1840, Māori owned the whole country. By 1864, there'd been a series of massive land purchases, especially in the South Island, but most of the North Island, especially the central North Island, was still in Māori hands. And for settlers in places like Auckland, that was a point of contention. And after that today, of course, the Māori land ownership is a tiny fraction of what it once was, although some lands have been returned as a result of the treaty settlements process that we're currently going through. So some of these like massive land purchases, one was called the Canterbury Purchase in 1848, that took in a large chunk of the South Island. In fact, it took in 20 million acres, which is nearly 1/3 of the entire country. And that was purchased for £2,000. And a few thousand acres of reserves out of 20 million acres. So the Māori who were involved in these land transactions often understood them quite differently from the British. They kind of assumed that both people would live together on the land and share them, because Māori didn't have a customary, a tradition of selling land. That was a completely foreign concept. But what happens is, as increasing numbers of settlers arrive, Māori are increasingly pushed to the fringes. They're pushed off those lands. So that doesn't happen overnight, but over time, Māori are marginalised. And a lot of rangatira, or chiefs, and their tribes become concerned about the impact of these transactions. And really, they fear that the country is slipping out of their hands piece by piece. And they see their own future basically as one of service to the settlers. So in this respect, that they understood that these land sales these were bigger than just real estate transactions. Effectively, they were losing control of their own country. Some tribes sought to respond to that by opposing further land sales. And And this was a strong impetus behind what's called the Maori King movement, where a Maori monarch, a Maori king, was established in 1858. And some settlers brand that a land league, an illegal land league that's blocking, the right of settlers, of Pākehā, to have access to these lands. So land is a really important factor in the wars. But as historians have pointed out, there's problems with attributing the wars solely to land. 50 years ago, these were often called the land wars, but that's not really the case anymore, because for one thing, it wasn't the settlers who were responsible for sending imperial troops into action. That was the governor. And often governors weren't that sympathetic towards the land hunger of settlers. And for many Māori, fears over the loss of land fed into these even more fundamental concerns about their own place in the changing colony. And that's bigger than just a question of land ownership. It went to the heart of how Māori and Pākehā would live together in this country. Would Māori share the same fate of other Indigenous peoples around the globe, being reduced to a state of subservience, and perhaps even facing the prospect of total extinction? Or on the other hand, this idea of New Zealand exceptionalism, was New Zealand somehow different? Would the promises held out in the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, basically that Māori land ownership would be scrupulously recognised and protected, Māori rights to manage their own affairs would be acknowledged, and that Māori would play a full role alongside the settlers in governing the colony? Would these promises be upheld by the Crown? Was New Zealand somehow different? And so at heart, these issues centre around an unresolved tension in the Treaty of Waitangi itself. So as part of that, in 1840, the British Crown proclaims sovereignty over the islands of New Zealand. But most chiefs, most rangatira, had signed a Māori language version of the treaty that stopped us a long way short of ceding sovereignty to the Crown. The term that was used, kawanatanga, can be translated as governance or governorship, which is not the same thing as sovereignty. And on the other hand, Māori communities had been promised full chiefly authority over their own affairs. So you have this tension between increasing Crown assertions of unbridled sovereignty, and on the other hand, Māori expectations of continuing chiefly authority. And this tension is not resolved in 1840. And a lot of the conflicts that are fought subsequently go to the heart of this. Whose version of that treaty is going to prevail? So the Treaty of Waitangi is signed in 1840, but it doesn't magically transform the colony into a place that's ruled by colonial administrators overnight. Outside a few coastal pockets of European settlement, the townships like Auckland and Wellington, Crown sovereignty remains a matter of negotiation and persuasion. In 1840, the Crown arrives with 100 troops, and they're confronted with about 100,000 Māori. So they're in no position to impose sovereignty over Māori. It's a matter of negotiation. But the one thing that signing the treaty does is signal the start of this period of mass British migration to New Zealand. And the result of that is Māori are very quickly outnumbered. By 1858, Māori become a minority in their own country for the first time ever. And after that, you can see that settler numbers, Pākehā numbers, increase massively. So by the late 19th century, Māori are a tiny percentage of the population. And a lot of those settlers who arrive in the country aren't willing to play second fiddle to a bunch of so-called natives. So you have these lurking Victorian assumptions of racial dominance that contribute to an erosion in relations with Māori, especially once those newcomers feel powerful enough to confront their hosts. And in this regard, I'd suggest it's no significance that in 1858, settler numbers are greater than Māori for the first time ever. And within 2 years of that, you get the start of the main sequence of New Zealand wars, which run from 1860 to 1872. So Māori may have hoped to have entered into a partnership with settlers, but Pākehā arrived here expecting to be in charge. They assumed that they were superior to Māori. They were at the apex of this imagined Victorian racial hierarchy. And as they start to sense the balance of power shifting in their favour, the old order, a kind of middle ground in which both parties kind of rub along with one another most of the time, gives way to this darker phase in relations. So one thing that settlers do is they demand the right to govern themselves. And you have a parliament that's set up in 1854, meets for the first time, the forerunner of today's New Zealand Parliament. And although Māori are still a majority of the population at that point, they're not represented in the parliament at all. It solely represents settlers' interests. And for a lot of chiefs who'd been promised partnership in the treaty, they feel that exclusion severely. So you have this body set up that's entirely hostile towards Māori interests. And successive New Zealand governments seem more intent on subjecting Māori to British laws than recognising any right of Māori to govern their own affairs, let alone protecting Māori ownership of their lands. So this government determination to achieve unbridled sovereignty, to turn its back on the Māori version of the treaty and instead uphold the Crown's version of that, a treaty of cession, can be seen really as an overarching kind of cause of the wars. Once the government had achieved a position of dominance, a lot of things would follow from that. And one thing would be that it would make further land purchasing much easier. And so too would the imposition of British law on Māori communities and their enforced assimilation into settler colonial society. So there was a lot riding on these wars. In the early period of European settlement, Pākehā had mostly been forced to tolerate Māori and their customs because they didn't have a choice to do otherwise. They weren't in a position to impose their will on Māori. But that changes by the late 1850s, and Pākehā begin to believe at last they're in a position to show Māori who's boss, basically. So in the past, you've had this discussion about land or sovereignty, which is the overriding cause of the wars, and I'd suggest that it's not a case of either or, because these are closely related. Without land, sovereignty meant little, and sovereignty, or at least something approximating the meaningful assertion of sovereignty, made it easier to acquire land and to reinforce that dominance. So these are closely bound together, and also you have these British ideas of race, about race and hierarchy, that influenced the way that a lot of the migrants viewed Māori. Anglo-Saxons expected to be in charge because they were at the apex of their own imagined racial hierarchy. So that's a brief outline of some of the main causes of the wars. And I'm going to turn briefly now and give a little bit of an outline as to the course of these conflicts. And so the wars, the main sequence of the wars begin in Northland, in the far north of the North Island, in March 1845, when Hone Heke and Kawati, some northern chiefs, take up arms against the Crown, and a series of battles are fought. The two most famous ones probably are Haiwai and Ruapekapeka. And Haiwai kind of sets a template because the British bombard this part of this fortification for a long period of time. They hear nothing from inside. They assume everybody's dead. They storm the pa, and within 10 minutes, 1/3 of the British storming party are cut down, killed or wounded. So Māori have developed this new fortification system that's specifically designed to counter British artillery. They have covered trenches and shelters, and these are very, very effective. And throughout the wars, British officers and commanders consistently underestimate Māori military ability, Māori military engineering expertise, and they pay for that. They suffer the consequences of that. And so this really begins in the Northern War. The government claims a crushing victory in the Northern War at Ruapekapeka in January 1846, but really that war ends indecisively. You have further conflicts in the Wellington and Whanganui regions in the centre of the country in the mid-1840s. Again, largely around the New Zealand Company's bungled land transactions in this area, but also these broader questions of sovereignty and authority. But then you get a long period of peace from the mid-1840s. Through the 1850s, Māori devote a lot of their energies to agriculture and trade, and actually through this period, they dominate New Zealand's economy in many ways, and they produce a large chunk of New Zealand's export income and a large proportion of the government's tax revenue. And they're also feeding settler populations in towns like Auckland and Wellington. One settler newspaper in Auckland in the mid-1840s says that settlers would have starved were it not for the produce that Māori brought to the town each week. So that's how reliant Pākehā are on Māori during this early period. That long period of peace ends in March 1860. You get the start of the first Taranaki War. And there you have Taranaki Māori protest the purchase of their lands with only minority support from their community. Led by Wiremu Kingi Te Rangatake, they send out Kiwi, an elderly woman from their tribe, to pull out survey pegs, and the government responds by calling this an act of rebellion and declaring martial law. And the first Taranaki War is fought for about a year, but it ends inconclusively, and that's partly because the Taranaki tribes receive assistance from Waikato and Ngāti Maniapoto tribes to the north of them. And that assistance from the Waikato tribes, along with rumours of a supposed attack on the settlement of Auckland, are used to justify the Crown's invasion of Waikato in July 1863. And this is the biggest of the New Zealand wars, the Waikato War, 1863 to 64. Waikato had been home since 1858 to the Māori king. And the kingitanga is set up as the Māori king movement is set up as a way to bring all of these different Māori tribes together. Because you've got a settler parliament that's set up that Māori have been excluded from. So if the government is not going to provide for Māori, allow Māori partnership, Māori begin to think about new forms of governance for themselves. Also as a way to stop further land sales. So it's a way of, they don't see it as something that's against settlers, they see it as something that's for Māori. But governors and settlers, or many settlers, view it as a challenge to Crown sovereignty. So Governor George Grey, a dominant figure in New Zealand history in the 19th century, sets out to destroy the kingitanga, the Māori king movement, because it's seen as a threat to the Crown's overall goal of imposing authority over Māori. And so you get what's been called, or called by one of the great Waikato chiefs, Wiremu Tamihana, the Great War for New Zealand. And I used his title, The Great War for New Zealand, for I wrote a very big book on this topic in 2016 that talked about this as a defining conflict in New Zealand history. In many ways, I argued more important than World War I or World War II, which in the past were seen as more significant conflicts. You know, this was a transformative, defining conflict in New Zealand history. The Waikato War takes place about 30 miles from Auckland, so basically on Auckland's doorstep, and it results in hundreds of Māori being evicted from their homes at gunpoint, and then pushes further south. I'll just go back for a moment to this slide. So one of the biggest early conflicts is at Rangiuri in November 1863, when the people inside the pa, inside the fortification, are controversially taken prisoner under a white flag of truce. And then the Crown pushes even further south. At Rangiawhia in February 1864, people are deliberately tortured to death inside their homes. And that attack is especially contentious. It's a source of great pain and bitterness even today, because Rangiawhia wasn't a pa, it wasn't a fortification, it was an open village. And it was supposed to be a place of sanctuary for women, children and old men, for non-combatants basically. But Crown forces attack them and people are killed. And the Waikato War ends at Arako, the final battle 31st of March to 2nd of April 1864. And there you have 300 people inside a pa. They soon run out of food and water and ammunition. The British assume that they're surrounded, but eventually the people inside the pa decide to try and break out. So they literally run for their lives, and they're hunted down by cavalry, while they're fleeing on foot, and large numbers are killed. And there are many documented cases of atrocities there, including female prisoners who are bayoneted by troops in cold blood. Pākehā later attempt to depict the Waikato War as a chivalrous and noble conflict marked by mutual heroism and bravery. But really, there was nothing noble or glorious about any of this. There were atrocities committed. And the Waikato War, although it was a decisive conflict in New Zealand history, it wasn't the end of the New Zealand Wars. You've got another 8 years of conflict that follows. So the indiscriminate and sweeping nature of Crown actions, which had seen large numbers of Maori attacked and their land seized and confiscated without provocation, that gives rise to new resistance. So the war spread throughout the North Island. You get further conflict in Taranaki and elsewhere across the North Island as well. And Māori turned to new religions of their own. One is called Pai Mārire, the good and peaceful religion, which is sort of a millenarian faith that Māori who believe in that faith will see British troops and settlers driven from the country. And that's branded a fanatical faith, and the wars enter a harsher and more racially tinged phase, really. In the late 1860s, at a time of great desperation for Māori, you get two remarkable military leaders and prophets who emerge. One is called Te Takuwaru, who emerges in Taranaki and on the east coast of the North Island, Tukoti. So late in 1868, the Crown suffer a series of spectacular defeats in Taranaki. And really the colony goes through a bit of an existential crisis. And this is at a time when many of the settlers complain bitterly about the unwillingness of British troops to fight anymore in the New Zealand Wars. They feel abandoned by the mother country. And you see acts of great savagery really at this time. At a place called Ngātapa in January 1869, you have 128 Māori who are lined up against the side of a cliff and shot. They're killed. And various other atrocities are committed as well. Eventually in Taranaki, Te Takuwaru's force disperses. Te Takuwaru eventually finds refuge in the King Country, which is the area south of Waikato, where survivors of that conflict had fled after 1864. And for the next 20 years, the King Country remains more or less autonomous. It's called the King Country because the Māori King and his followers live there, and they remain outside the writ of British law really until the 1880s. So the final shots in the main sequence of the wars end in 1872. There are later conflicts, but they're not part of the main sequence of the New Zealand Wars. One of these happens at a place called Parihaka, where on the 5th of November 1881, so 139 years ago today, I think, your time, the settlement is invaded by armed constabulary, 1,600 armed constabulary. And at a place called Parihaka, you have a non-violent resistance movement, which is led by two great prophets called Te Whiti and Tohu o Rongamai. So the troops who invade Parihaka are greeted by skipping, singing and dancing children. These are some of the children who greet the troops there. So, you know, is it even still war if only one side carries guns and has a determination to fight? And what happened at Parihaka is something that, you know, lives long in national consciousness, really. So the actual fighting ends in 1872, but in many ways the legacy of the wars continues to be felt today. And for one thing, I'd suggest that awareness and knowledge of this historical context is crucial to fully understanding the present. So any understanding of contemporary Maori poverty that fails to acknowledge this long history of invasion, dispossession and confiscation is really missing a vital part of the story. And that leaves some observers blaming Māori themselves for their predicament today. They resort to, you know, deficit theory to explain these things. Even though in the 1840s, 1850s, Māori were the drivers of the New Zealand economy, incredibly prosperous, and that is really destroyed almost overnight in the 1860s. And you can see a lot of connections today in terms of the influence of the wars. New Zealand wars are a big part of the reason why Auckland's our largest city today, and why there are more people in the North Island compared with the South Island. They were transformative events in our national history in many ways, and they're also, relatively significant in wider imperial terms. These were the first foreign wars that Australian troops fought in. The Waikato War is the first overseas war that Australian troops fought as well. So the New Zealand Wars leave a large number of people killed or wounded. Maybe 6,000 in total was our best estimate, but that's a very rough estimate. Over 2/3 of them Maori. And in some areas, if you look at the local impact of that, this is one district that I looked at, Taranaki or Gisborne, it's better known as, or Poverty Bay, called it, but we try not to call it Poverty Bay these days. Taranaki is the Maori name for the district. There between 1865 and 1869, I conservatively estimated that 20% of the population, 1 in 5, died in the space of 4 years. So a staggering level of loss. And if we compare that with World War I, which is traditionally seen as the greatest bloodbath in New Zealand history, in World War I, the total casualty rate was 5.8% of the New Zealand population, of whom 1.7% were killed. And that's always been seen as the greatest bloodbath in New Zealand history. In relative terms, more than 10 times that number died in one district alone. And the district of Taranaki or Gisborne is not an isolated example. You could find that elsewhere. So I talked about the impact of the wars on the Maori economy as well, that were destroyed. Allied to that, you had the confiscation of more than 3 million acres of Maori lands. And that confiscation is applied indiscriminately. Even Maori who had fought for the Crown have their lands confiscated. There's a return done in 1900 of Maori rendered landless as a result of confiscations, and there are thousands and thousands of names on that list. And so behind each name there's a story of dispossession and exile and homelessness. And in terms of these two competing visions of what the treaty relationship would be about, Maori expectations of partnership on the other hand, Crown hopes to assert unbridled sovereignty. The Crown did enough in these wars to impose its version of the treaty. And so this is a treaty of cession and unbridled sovereignty, not partnership and dialogue. And Māori are basically marginalised for the next century or more. The Treaty of Waitangi is basically thrown out the window. And that has almost immediate consequences. So the Waikato War ends in 1864. Within a year of that, you get a new body set up that's called the Native Land Court. And that's been described as an engine of destruction for Māori societies, because what it does is individualise or detribalize Māori ownership of lands. And it means that instead of tribal ownership, any one individual in that community can be targeted to sell that land, and that destroys tribal ownership of those lands. It results in very heavy land loss. 2 years later, in 1867, you get a native school system set up. And that's really an agent of assimilation. One of the things that the native school system does is try to ban the speaking of the Maori language. So these two bodies that are set up, they wouldn't have been possible before the New Zealand Wars. One strips Māori of their lands, the other of their language. And in many ways, we still live with the consequences of that today. So settlers are no longer required to even pay lip service to this notion of partnership with Māori. And not until the 1970s do things begin to change in a new kind of meaningful way. The wars left Māori communities with deeply entrenched grievances that we're still attempting to unravel and unpack today. We have a treaty settlements process that we're still engaged in to pay some compensation for these past losses, although that compensation is often about 1% of what was lost typically. So it's a tiny fraction of what was lost. All of this history is unfamiliar to a lot of New Zealanders because we never learned about it at school. Generations of New Zealanders didn't learn this history at all. What I've been arguing the last few years is, as a nation, we need to take ownership of that history. One of the ways we do that is to learn that history. That's the first thing. And what a nation chooses to remember and forget really speaks to its priorities and a sense of identity. So we need to move beyond the myth-making and historical amnesia about these wars and openly and honestly confront this history. That's not about assigning blame. It's just about growing up as a nation and being big enough and brave enough to own our history, warts and all. And, you know, we're starting to turn a corner on that. So last year, the Prime Minister announced that New Zealand history would be taught in all schools in 2022. Up until now, we've had what's been called a high autonomy curriculum, which basically means that individual schools and their teachers get to decide what they teach. And a lot of those schools have shied away from this history in the past. I've seen it as too contentious, too controversial. So from 2022, hopefully all schools will be learning this history. And that's something that actually that young people were leading the charge on. A few years ago, we had a group of secondary school students, high school students, who started a petition that called for a National Day of Commemoration for the New Zealand Wars and for this history to be taught in all schools. And that's something that's going to happen soon. And I think that will be, if it's done properly, that is going to be hugely significant, and that's going to be transformative, that New Zealanders will begin to engage with this history, to learn this history, to take ownership of this history. So I think I've probably said enough for now. I'll finish up there and see if you've got any questions for me, and also close down this PowerPoint.
Thanks very much. I thought that was an absolute education for me as someone in the UK with very limited understanding, really. So unfortunately, we're having some technical difficulties with cameras here, so you have to bear with us. But I did have one question. We're going through, in the UK at the moment, I guess a political movement, a grassroots movement in the history teaching community, academic community, and also involved, young people are involved with it too. And it sounds like you've gone through something similar in New Zealand, with New Zealand history becoming compulsory on the school's curriculum. We're calling for a similar thing in our case with British colonial history. Currently only the Holocaust is compulsory, and making that compulsory at Key Stage 3 at least, and hopefully at Key Stage 4. So that's sort of 11 to 13 for us at Key Stage 3, and 14 to 16 for us at Key Stage 4. So what we call GCSE. So I just wondered really two things. Firstly, whether you had any kind of words of optimism for teachers who are trying to push this through and perhaps being pushed back by members of Parliament. There was a debate about it last week or a few weeks ago in Parliament during Black History Month, or being pushed back by members of the media, etc. Whether you had any kind of words of advice or words of optimism for us, or equally what you might say to those people who are perhaps against such a change. I don't know if you experienced that in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, I've been following that debate in Britain quite closely, and again, I mean, I talked before about how in New Zealand young people had kind of been leading the charge for this with the what was called the Otahonga College petition, and I noticed similar things in Britain. One group I follow is the fill in the blank students in London who have been pushing the charge for this, and that's really encouraging. And I think in some ways, these, you know, in order for this to be effective, it really needs to be a grassroots campaign rather than something that's imposed from top down. So I think the first people is to get communities engaged in this, and this is something in New Zealand that, you know, this didn't really come from nowhere. It didn't emerge overnight. myself and many others had been really campaigning, speaking up for years about this and about our kind of colonial cringe, where we would know more about the history of other countries than we would about our own. And what does that do to a sense of, the place that you grow up in, not having a basic awareness of its history and its place in the world? And obviously, in the case of Britain, that history is huge, and the history of British imperialism is central. And I think the message really around that, to people who oppose that, is don't be afraid of this. This shouldn't be about a finger-pointing exercise. It's really just about being mature enough to take ownership of your history as a nation and say, this is part of our story, and part of the way that you heal from that history and you reconcile yourself to that history is to accept it in the first place and to learn about it, to engage in that history. And that's a positive thing. That's really empowering for young people when they know their history. They've got a sense of who they are, where they come from. So I think it's, I'm sure that this is something that will happen in Britain at some point in the future, and it's just a matter of pushing on and ensuring that people understand that this shouldn't be something that they're scared by.
I guess kind of linked to that, coming from somebody who's big into rugby, obviously we look to New Zealand often as somewhere not only who are very good at rugby, but also almost where Maori culture is quite celebrated. And I just wondered, to what degree is it actually celebrated, from a kind of New Zealand perspective, and somebody who clearly is very learned in New Zealand history? To what extent is it celebrated actually, and is our perception incorrect? And also just maybe why, if we are right in our thinking that it is celebrated to a degree, why is that?
Well, I think the first thing is probably simple demographics. Māori are 15-16% of the population, so and increasing over time as well. That number is growing, and Māori and Pākehā, Māori and people of European descent, there's been huge intermarriage. There are very close connections, whether that is in the rugby team or in the schoolroom or wherever else. So there's always been that, those connections. For a long time, there was this kind of disjunction between how Māori and Pākehā kind of remembered their history. And for Pākehā, it was kind of slapping themselves on the back and saying, greatest race relations in the world. Aren't we great? Aren't we wonderful? And Māori had this kind of other history of the country, which was marked by losses, by tragedy, by atrocities and so on, that wasn't really shared, wasn't communicated. And really, it's only been in the last 5 or 10 years that started to change. And there's still some resistance to that in some quarters, but on the whole, most New Zealanders kind of are on board with this. One of the really interesting things is when the Prime Minister announced last year that New Zealand history would be taught in all schools. This was something that was endorsed by the opposition as well. So there's consensus across the board. In some places, this could be used as sort of a wedge issue, culture wars issue around that. But there was not that here at all. There's kind of more or less universal acceptance of course we should do that. And that has been the product of 40 or 50 years of increasing increasing campaigns to ensure that Pākehā begin to engage with that history. So it's not something that's happened overnight. It's taken a very long time. But today you see many Pākehā who are, for example, learning to speak Māori. So large numbers of people, and it's seen as a very positive thing. And if you're a young middle class kid at school today, probably learning the Māori language is quite a smart thing to do for your future job prospects. If you want to work in the civil service or something like that, that's a really great thing to have on your CV. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there is growing engagement, awareness, and acceptance. It hasn't always been there, but it's becoming stronger.
And do you think that the classification of the Maori Wars as just that, a war, has helped? I mean, I was talking to a historian about Australian history last week, and obviously there's been a lot of the history wars over there. There's been a heck of a lot of debate about whether it is a war or not, and there seems to be now in historiography, among historians at least, an acceptance that it was a war. Do you think that it actually being always classified as a war in New Zealand has helped with that process?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously in Australia, the frontier wars were completely different dynamics because you didn't have British Imperial regiments marching into Aboriginal communities in the same way that you did in New Zealand. So here, there's never really been any debate about the wars. But one of the interesting things is that there has been what we call the wars has changed over time, and it used to be for a long period of time they were called the Maori Wars, which was kind of like part of that British tradition of naming wars after your enemies, so the Boer War or the Indian Mutiny or whatever. And then, over time, historians in New Zealand, began to think, well, weren't there some other parties in these conflicts that need to be acknowledged as well? So for a time, that people referred to them as the land wars, which kind of was intended to indicate a viewpoint sympathetic towards Māori, because it's saying that these wars were land grabs, basically. But what that ignored was that there were these bigger issues, or these wider issues at stake around sovereignty as well. So, yeah, I mean, there's never really been any doubt about these being wars and these being significant events, but how we've thought about them has certainly changed over time. And I think today there is an increasing awareness of Māori military sophistication and military engineering genius in these wars. I mean, if you visit some of the surviving part today, it's hard to miss that. It's very, very obvious. Unfortunately, a lot of the past sites, a lot of the battle sites have been destroyed in the past. Often roads will run through the middle of them and that kind of thing. So the ones that are relatively intact today tend to be in more remote locations.
And would they be? It's obviously the one you showed us, that like an earthwork. Would they have had kind of? Is that like a rampart with a wall on top? How would they have kind of worked or functioned?
The one I showed you was slightly unusual in that it was, I think, modelled on a British redoubt, but most of the pa would have had ramparts and trenches. Like some of the trenches were, like the Battle of Rangiretti, the trenches were 4 metres deep, and the British ladders weren't long enough to get over the top of that. So large numbers of troops are killed in the act of trying to scale those. And the trenches were often they'd be designed with zigzags in them, so that if troops did get in, they couldn't fire down the length of them, that sort of thing. So there's that attention to detail in how these are constructed. And these pa, what James Belch refers to as the modern pa system, are completely new. They're completely unlike earlier pre-European Māori forms of warfare, because they've been explicitly designed to counter British artillery.
I suppose in a weird way, kind of what you're describing there with the zigzag, almost a precursor to trenches, I suppose, in many ways, in the Western Front and Gallipoli, etc. 40, 50, 70 years later. Which is interesting. In terms of the significance of the conflict in New Zealand today, you said obviously it's going to become a feature of schools history, etc. Are we seeing that in New Zealand in kind of public history already, in terms of, you know, museums or documentaries that people are able to access from the media? Or is that again something that's kind of growing with, or you hope will grow with, schools education, etc., as these things?
I think we're starting to move in that direction a bit. There's still a lot more that could be done, but in the last few years, there have been a series of documentaries that Radio New Zealand have made that are, I think, available on YouTube about the wars, and more of those have been made and released over time. There's still a lot that we could do with these stories, and also with protecting the sites of what's left of them. With resources, I mean, in the last 4 years, I've published 2 books on this. One, the very big book on the Waikato War called The Great War for New Zealand. That's a 700-page long book. And the other one called The New Zealand Wars, which is intended really as an introduction for senior secondary school students. So that's, a sort of 200-page book with lots of illustrations and so on that provides an overview of these conflicts. And not just written for school students, but also adults who didn't learn any of this history at school, because so many people come up to me and tell me when I give talks and so on, I knew nothing about this. Why did I not know this history of my own country? And people are being introduced to that history for the first time ever, now, and for some it's quite shocking.
And obviously you've got your blog, meetingplace.new Zealand as well, which I'll put in the links to this video. So if anybody wants to go and look at that, check out the links underneath, and you can use those. I don't know if your books, etc., are available in the UK for teachers and things, if they were interested to purchase. I don't know if we can get.
They're definitely available as ebooks. Hard copies, I'm not sure yet. I think the publishers are working on that. But Bridget Williams Books published my recent work, so that's the publisher to check, bwb.co.nz.co.nz.
Brilliant, and I'll put that in the comments for people as well. So if you're interested, go and check that. Two more questions, and really I'm talking to quite a few historians at the moment about colonial history from different aspects, Australia, like I mentioned, and India and a few others. And I'm asking really the same questions to everybody. Obviously in the UK, that teaching of empire at the moment, there's a bit of or has been historically, a bit of an obsession with teaching a kind of balance sheet. And historians are trying really hard to wean us off that, rightly. But obviously one of the things, or one of the core narratives which is often taught, is this idea of a civilizing mission. Can we see examples of that in New Zealand?
Well, for a long period of time, to the extent that people were taught anything about the Treaty of Waitangi, it was explained as this great experiment in humanitarian imperialism, which is a contradiction in terms: imperialism, humanitarianism. So today, we're kind of looking at those issues more critically, and so this idea of New Zealand is the great exception to bad imperialism, to sort of the idea of good imperialism in New Zealand is, I think, something that doesn't really stack up anymore. I mean, of course, as part of colonizing missions, colonizers always claim that that's for the benefit of the people that whose lands are taking over. But that's, justifying those things is one thing, but where the reality was often quite different as well. So yeah, I think that notion of a sort of benevolent imperialism in New Zealand is something that's been discredited. A few years ago, our former Prime Minister, John Key, provoked controversy when he said New Zealand was settled peacefully by settlers, and a number of people pointed out that that was far from the case. So he was sort of ridiculed for making that statement about peaceful settlement.
Apologies to both yourself and anyone who's listening. If you can hear a dog in the background, that's my dog Mila, who's wondering where I am. Apologies. There she goes. One last question, and again, I'm asking this to really all the historians I'm talking to at the moment. In history teaching in the UK, there's often, I don't want to say an obsession, but often India as a colony is taught really above all else, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. Why should teachers in the UK teach the history of New Zealand, the New Zealand Wars or other?
Well, I mean, I think the history of how Maori and Pākehā engaged with one another in New Zealand is incredibly interesting, and some of the things I talked about in terms of the way that Maori adapted their military engineering and more broadly, you can kind of see, you can find parallels with the wider history of imperialism as well, if you move beyond this notion of New Zealand exceptionalism. And, in 1863 or 64, there's a huge number of British troops in New Zealand. So although these are often classed as small wars, that was not an insignificant number of troops that were here. And it's also significant in terms of Australian history as well, the number of Australians who came and fought in these wars. So in terms of the wider history of Britain and New Zealand, I think that's, that history is incredibly vital. And it also, when you drill down into it, you can explore other aspects of this history as well, such as the Irish angle, which I mentioned. So there are a lot of different facets of this where you can there are layers to this history, and once you start to unpick those, you find a lot of parallels with events that happened elsewhere, and people at the time who draw those parallels were thinking about those connections with other parts of empire as well.
Absolutely, I think you're right, and the Irish angle is incredibly interesting, a really rich opportunity for teachers. Thank you so much. As I said, I think that's, for me personally, an absolute education, but I'm sure the same for other teachers who are listening to and watching this as well. So again, I'll add into the description all of the links for Dr. O'Malley's books and his blog meetingplace.New Zealand as well. But if you do have any other comments or questions and things, I think I'm right in saying you're up on Twitter. I don't know if you want to tell people your @ so they could ask any questions.
Yeah, sure. It's just V O'Malley with no apostrophe.
Great. So any questions or anything, I'm sure be happy to answer. But again, all that's left for me to say really is thank you so much, and look out for more videos from the Be Bold History Network soon. Thanks.
Thanks for watching this video from the Be Bold History Network. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter @BeBoldHistory, and if you are talking about us, use the hashtag BeBoldHistory. Thanks for watching.